All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Sellers. I'm the Assistant Director for Regional Engagement with NC State's Alumni Association. We're so excited to be offering the second program in the Campus History series, and this is the history of NC State basketball in partnership with our partners and friends over at NC State Libraries. I want to take a moment for thanking all of you for joining us tonight, especially those who are friends of the libraries or members of the NC State Alumni Association. And now I'm going to hand it over to Allison Hughes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Hughes, and I'm part of the Program Planning and Outreach team here at NC State Libraries. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's event. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to invite Chris Carson from Friends of the Library to provide our welcome.
Yeah, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Carson and I'm a new board member of Friends of the Library. And I'd like again to say on behalf of Friends of the Library, welcome to the second program in the Campus History series, The History of Basketball at NC State. And if you're interested in engaging with our cutting edge libraries on campus, I encourage you to consider becoming a friend of the library. We host a variety of events, programs throughout the year, plus raise funds to support the success of students on campus. So I'm going to put a link in our chat room on the Zoom meeting that will lead you to more information about Friends of the Library. And I hope you enjoy tonight's program.
Thank you, Chris. During the presentation, we ask that you remain muted. If you have any questions or memories you'd like to share, please place them in the chat and we'll collect them for a question and answer session after the presentation. Our presenters today are Tim Peeler and Roger Winstead. Tim Peeler is a Vail, North Carolina native who traces his roots in the state to somewhere around 1740. His family has been here ever since, though he personally was outsourced to South Carolina for about 5 years in the 1990s. He's been back in Raleigh since 1994 and at NC State since 2004. After receiving an English degree from NC State in 1987, Tim has written for newspapers, magazines, websites, and all kinds of media outlets. He's written 3.5 books on NC State basketball and is in the beginning stages of his next one. Currently, Tim works for NC State's University Marketing and Communications, where he writes about what is going on at NC State with its students, its alumni, and history. I'm going to put some more information about Tim in the chat for you guys to check out as well. Roger Winstead is also with us today, a graduate of NC State, the son of an alumnus, father of a current student, husband of a graduate, and former NC State employee. Roger bleeds a deeper hue of red. He watched the '74 national championship on TV as a 3rd grader and experienced the '83 national championship season firsthand as a freshman photographer. Roger moved from Rocky Mount to Raleigh in 1982, where he immediately joined the Agromac yearbook staff and eventually technician. After graduation in 1787 with a communications degree, Roger worked for 10 years.
Oops. Lost you, Allison.
Oh, sorry about that.
There you are.
Let's see.
You said I was in graduated college in 1787, which Tim noticed.
I'm sorry. He graduated college in 1987. He worked as a photojournalist at the News and Observer and 20 years in university communications with NC State. He currently works at Northridge Country Club as Director of Communications. Last year, Roger and Tim were on a steering committee to help celebrate Technician's 100th anniversary. An exhibit celebrating this milestone will be on display at D.H. Hill Library at the end of March. We would also love to hear your feedback on this event and are placing a survey in the chat. Participants who complete the survey will have the chance to enter into a raffle to win Tim's books. Thank you, and I'm going to hand it off to Tim and Roger.
Let me just add that Roger and I were students together at NC State in the 1980s, and we had a lot of good times then. And hopefully tonight we'll have some good times, and we will share a limited portion of some of our experiences together while we were students at NC State.
I'm just going to mostly let Tim speak, so I'm going to be quiet. I'm just going to be driving the train and showing the pictures from a lot of the pictures from the book and some additional pictures. So all this is Tim.
Well, it's nice looking in the participant list and seeing some familiar names, some familiar faces, and people I engage with a lot via being here on campus at NC State, on Twitter, Facebook, all those social media outlets that keep us connected. I just want to start out by saying football is about great athletes being on a huge stage. Baseball is about numbers, finding just the right statistics to show how great your favorite player is compared to some other player. If we had time, I would explain to you in detail exactly why Ted Williams, Carl Yastrzemski, and Jim Ed Rice were the greatest left field trio of all time. But tonight, I want to talk about basketball. And basketball, for me, is about personalities, the people who make the game fun, the people who bring emotion and passion to our campus, to the state, and on a national stage. And I don't think anybody could argue that NC State has had some of the most amazing personalities in college basketball history. I have a friend who always says he was going to put together a book about ACC basketball personalities, but he's going to have to split it into two books. He's going to have to split it into one about the truly enjoyable people from NC State who have played basketball or coached basketball in one book. And then he will put all the other mildly interesting people who have ever been in ACC basketball in another book. But NC State gets its own. What other school can claim without anybody being able to deny it that its first basketball game was rained out? What other school had a former coach who was almost arrested by his own bodyguard? Who else had a one and done player who played his entire career at NC State with his name misspelled on the back of his jersey? Who else had both its centers knocked out of action while winning a tournament in Hawaii because one of them was in a moped accident and the other one fell asleep and pinched a nerve in his elbow on the way home? What other school, except its opponent, could say it took 8 weeks to complete an ACC basketball game? What other school had David Thompson? NC State has had all of those things and more. It has had some of the brightest personalities: Everett Case, Jim Valvano, Norm Sloan, Kay Yao, so many people who have made a difference in the world of college basketball. And I really want to explore some of those today. Jim Valvano is one of my favorites. He's the reason I went into writing, because I was a student reporter at Technician during his the heyday of his career. I got here in the fall of 1983, which means I was born 1 year too late to be a freshman and on campus for the 1983 National Championship. But being a reporter and being around Jim Valvano is what inspired me to become a writer. And my newspaper career inspired me to come to NC State and delve into a much deeper learning about the history of the sport at NC State. Jim Valvano is widely recognized as the biggest personality of NC State history. But if you look at some of these others, he may not even be in the top 5 of the most interesting people who have ever been here at NC State. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, which I can do really without taking a breath, but I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions at the end of this thing, and I'll stay as long as anybody wants, because I like to hear your memories and the things that made your experience at NC State connected to basketball, and what you remember most. What I'm going to talk about is mostly chronological, because that's the way most people's minds work. And for the purposes of this discussion, it's the best way to talk about various personalities. So we advertise talks about basketball in North Carolina as being about Tobacco Road, but I always avoid that phrase because I hate it. I was a freshman in English at NC State when I read Erskine Caldwell's book, which is about sharecroppers in Georgia who are involved in eugenics, incest, violence, murder, all kinds of things. It's the worst portrayal of people from a place that is not even in North Carolina. That book was set in Georgia. I know North Carolina has tobacco roots and tobacco money and tobacco everything, but I do not like referring to being here in the Triangle and the schools in North Carolina as Tobacco Road. And really, all you ever hear now talking about Tobacco Road is when ESPN talks about the Duke Carolina game. So forget all that. So if you saw the news today, NC State against Virginia Tech was canceled because of COVID protocols. But the very first game NC State was ever supposed to play was against Virginia Tech. It was going to be played in Norfolk, Virginia in Thanksgiving of 1910. Just before the day before NC State played Virginia Tech in football. But leading up to the game, it rained in Raleigh all week. And the only basketball court on campus is on Red Diamond Field in Fulton Park. And it was so muddy, they couldn't practice, so they had to cancel the game. So NC State and Virginia Tech have had a history of not being able to get their games in sometimes, going back to the first game that was ever scheduled at NC State or for NC State. There's another game that's supposed to be played that January against North Carolina. The Board of Trustees both approved that game, but the two schools were fighting so much over who was eligible to play and represent both schools that they were never able to play it. So the first season of NC State basketball was just between NC State and Wake Forest. Wake Forest won at its gym. NC State won here at Pullen Hall, a building that no longer exists because it was burned down by a student arsonist in 1965. There is a Pullen Hall on campus, but it is not the original one. There was only one game ever played at Pullen Hall, and that was it. I want to talk a little bit about the association. The YMCA is what created basketball from the very beginning, and it's what drove basketball to be spread across the world, really. If you don't know, basketball was invented by Dr. James Naismith in 1891 at the Springfield, Massachusetts YMCA. He posted 13 rules of the game and put them up on and let the students there play the game. It was vastly different than what it is today. There were peach baskets that the ball went into. There was a jump ball after every basket. There was a you could only dribble once in the backcourt. There was no mid-court line, any of those things. It was a very different game. Interesting note, James Naismith's granddaughter is a graduate of NC State. She graduated at the same time Roger and I did. But one of the first people who took the game from Springfield, Massachusetts to Indiana was a guy named Richard Crozier. He brought the game from Evanston, Indiana to North Carolina in 1906 at Wake Forest. Wake Forest only played a couple schools. They played Trinity, which we now call Duke. They played Guilford. They played Davidson. And in 1911, they played NC State. Well, Dr. Crozier went on to medical school to get his medical degree. And then he came back and was the coach at NC State. He was also the trainer who took care of athletes at NC State. So right after World War I, we had the guy who brought basketball to Indiana, from Indiana to North Carolina. His name was Red. That's what everybody called him. So how perfect is that? Red Crozier was one of our first basketball coaches. Basketball in the 20s and in the 30s was not exactly the most prominent thing on campus. There were some good players. Connie McBarry was a player who led the Southern Conference in scoring. He also played professionally in 3 different sports: baseball, basketball, and football. And Bones McKinney, who is a famous name to many North Carolinians because he was a player at NC State and at North Carolina, and the coach at Wake Forest, and a very funny guy, played here in those years, but it really was not the focus. In fact, during World War II, NC State had a part-time coach. He was actually the director of the State Highway Patrol. And as a sidelight, he coached NC State basketball. He was paid $600 a year to be the part-time coach. And he never really had an affiliation. He was a star athlete in the 30s at NC State, but he really never had any association or affiliation with the school anymore. But what changed things was in 1946, there was a meeting of sports fans in Raleigh, North Carolina at the old Sir Walter Raleigh Hotel in downtown Raleigh. There was just a bunch of people who were interested in basketball, or interested in football. Actually, it was a football club and other sports. And they invited as their guest a man named Chuck Taylor. Now, if you're wearing tennis shoes like I am right now, they might be lace up canvas shoes from Converse called Chucks. Chuck Taylor is where that name comes from. He was the speaker at the club, and someone pulled him aside and said, "Hey, Chuck, tell us who we should hire as the basketball coach. We want to ramp this thing up. We want to make it a big deal. We don't want to have a part-time coach anymore. We're willing to pay more than $600 a year to have a basketball coach." And so Chuck Taylor said, there's a guy who is a lieutenant commander in the Navy out in Ottumwa, Iowa. He is the best basketball coach in the country, and nobody has hired him. His name is Everett Case. When Everett Case decided, instead of going to Purdue back in his hometown, 20 minutes away from his little town in Frankfort, Indiana, he decided, instead of going to Purdue, that he was going to come to NC State. He brought with him the best player he saw in the military when he was coaching for the U.S. Navy in the military. His name was Dick Dickey. Dick Dickey went on to become a 4-time All-Southern Conference player and a 3-time All-American. Nobody's been more decorated than Dick Dickey, other than David Thompson, in the history of NC State NC State basketball. But it was more for Everett Case to come here than just being able to play basketball. At the time, NC State had a terrible gym. Thompson Gymnasium was built in 1925, and it quickly went out of date. So Everett Case knew if he was going to have a real basketball program, he needed to have an arena. He was lured to NC State because the athletic administration at the time told him, "We have a new basketball gym being built on our campus, and it's nearly complete." Well, that's not really what it was. Reynolds Coliseum was started in 1941, and for 7 years, it had nothing but 7 steel girders sitting up on the middle of the campus. And there was no construction going on whatsoever when Everett Case decided he was going to come to NC State. He was a little surprised when he got here and saw those 7 girders standing up. Interesting the thing about Everett Case, though, is he saw that and said, "I can make this better. I can make it bigger." Reynolds Coliseum was built on the same architectural plans as Cameron Indoor Stadium. And he said, "I want to extend that structure to 12 girders. I'm going to make it a long shoebox. I'm going to dig into the 4-foot concrete foundation of that building that you have, or that structure that you have there, and put a full-length basement in there. I'm going to make this the biggest arena between New York and New Orleans," 2 of Everett Case's favorite places, by the way. And so that's what he did. He changed the entire structural plans of Reynolds Coliseum, which is why it was so long, which was why it had some really great seats and some horrible seats up in the corners, away from the basket, on those low slopes that went from the end lines up to the roof. But it was a palace, an absolute palace. I contend, and I've had arguments about this, but I contend Reynolds Coliseum is the most important building ever constructed in the state of North Carolina. Now, some people say it might be the state capitol, or Greensboro Coliseum, or some other places around the state. There is no building that is more important to the economic growth in Raleigh and the growth of basketball in the state of North Carolina and around the ACC and around the country than Reynolds Coliseum. And there's nobody more important than Everett Case in developing that. It was a place that could host concerts, it could host basketball games, and it did host the ACC tournament, the Southern Conference tournament, the NCAA tournament, the Dixie Classic. It was the place. Here's the thing about Everett Case. What he did his entire life, his first basketball job, they had a gym, it wasn't good enough, they built him a new one. His second basketball gym, they built him a new one because they never had one at the school before. His third place in Frankfort, Indiana, where he became famous, they built him a gym. He even got someone at the U.S. Navy facility in Ottumwa, Iowa, to build him a new basketball gym so his military teams could play just after World War II. When he got to NC State, he saw a world of possibilities, how he can make basketball bigger than football, which was the biggest thing in the South, how he could make basketball as big as it was in Indiana, where he grew up, where he was a coach, where he in 1925, the only time this has ever happened, he won the Indiana single class high school basketball championship. And James Naismith was in the building and came down out of the stands, took the shield that they gave to every state champion at that time and handed it to Everett Case, shook his hand, shook the hands of every one of his players, and then went back to Kansas where he was an administrator. It's the only time James Naismith had ever been to the Indiana high school basketball championship. So Everett Case saw the possibilities here. He made Reynolds Coliseum not just a basketball court, but a stage. He made it the biggest and best place to play basketball. He put that noise meter that we all remember in the middle of in the rafters. There was a first one and the second one, and now that restored second one is in the Reynolds Coliseum Museum and Walk of Fame. You can go there and see it now and operate it just like we used to do in the old days. He brought spotlights out on the court. He brought a pep band and put it in the arena. He did all these things to make it not just a game, but an event, just like all those events that we all went to in Reynolds Coliseum through the years. I know I saw Van Halen and David Allan Coe and Kenny Rogers and how many different people did we see as in concerts there? That's what Everett Case wanted to make basketball. Every game was a feast. That's what he loved to say about basketball. It's a banquet, it's a feast, and the last bite is always the best. Interesting thing about being a stage, when Everett Case changed all of the structural plans for Reynolds Coliseum, he asked the engineers, good NC State engineers, could they possibly take the court and put it on something that could rotate throughout the course of the game very slowly so that everybody in the arena could see and have a great seat at some point during the game, and it would slowly rotate throughout the course of the game. They said it could be done, but Reynolds Coliseum was already being built on a post-war budget, and they didn't quite have enough money to do it. But that's what he wanted to do. Everett Case was a showman. Something I learned, didn't know that much about. Indiana is the home of the circus. Ringling Brothers, Hollenbeck, all of those circuses had their winter headquarters in Indiana. Everett Case saw that as a kid. He wanted to be a showman, and that's what he brought to NC State. NC State was the greatest show on earth in basketball in the 1940s, the 1950s, until Everett Case retired and subsequently passed away in the mid 1960s. This is Everett Case with his team celebrating. One of the things that Everett Case brought to North Carolina and to the ACC, the Southern Conference first, in the ACC, was an old Indiana tradition where the players would go and snip the nets after every game or after every championship. They would take turns cutting them down, and that was what he did to celebrate. We have pictures. The first time this ever happened in college basketball was at Duke Indoor Stadium, now Cameron Indoor Stadium, after he won his first conference championship, 1947. Everett Case won 6 straight Southern Conference championships, and 3 straight ACC championships. He lost his last Southern Conference championship by 1 point to Wake Forest. But in 10 years, his first 10 years at NC State, he won 9 conference championships. Nobody's ever replicated that kind of success anywhere over a course of 10 years like that. He went to 1 Final Four. He lost. It happened to be the time when college basketball was going through a major point shaving scandal, and the 2 teams that finished ahead of NC State, because they used to have a consolation game, NC State finished 3rd that year. City College of New York and the other team that was in the finals, both were caught up in the gambling scandals and had their participation in the tournament vacated. If you really wanted to, I'm not saying I do, I'm not saying it should, but you could count NC State as the 1950 NCAA champions, because they did not. The 2 teams ahead of them were caught up in the gambling scandals. Everett Case had cancer. He had various ailments through his life and through his career. 1965, he was scheduled to retire, but 2 games into that season, 64-65 season, the cancer was too much, and he had to retire. He retired with 2 games remaining or 2 games into the season, and 18 months later, he died. One of the great things about Everett Case is that he left 2/3 of his fortune to his only sister to take care of her for the rest of his life, and the rest of his estate he left to his players. He gave a number of shares to a certain number of shares to each player who graduated, and those players' lives were affected and impacted deeply throughout his life. Now, I'm talking a whole lot about him because he is the father of ACC basketball, but we have so many people who followed up in him. One of his players, Norm Sloan, came from Indiana to play for Everett Case and eventually became the basketball coach at NC State. Norm was a fiery guy. They called him Storm and Norman, and for a good reason. Just like Storm and Norman called the media the Worm Brigade. He did not like them. He did not enjoy his time with them. So he had his own way of dealing with people, but he was a colorful guy, and not just for those plaid jackets that he used to wear. He won his first ACC championship 50 years ago last year. His 1970 team beat South Carolina, which was ranked number 2 in the country at the time, and had won every ACC game up until that point. But NC State beat them in that game. That allowed Norm Sloan to recruit the greatest class of players in the history of NC State and possibly the ACC. He got Tommy Burleson to come down from the mountains of North Carolina to play basketball for him. And Tommy was good friends with the player from Shelby, North Carolina, named David Thompson. David Thompson changed everything about college basketball. At the time, as hard as it might be to believe, no one was allowed to dunk. It was a rule instituted in 1966 because of the arrival of Lou Alcindor to college basketball. They thought UCLA would be too dominant with Alcindor, who we now know as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, to have a player who could dunk all the time. So it was eliminated. David Thompson played his entire career without the ability to dunk, as did Tommy Burleson. So what they were able to do, though, was use 2 guys, Monty Tao, a 5'7" point guard, who mastered the ability to throw a alley-oop pass, and Tim Stoddard, who was a baseball and basketball player, who also mastered the ability to throw a alley-oop pass, which is basically catching the ball above the rim and laying it in. That's what made David Thompson so artful. That team went on to win 57 out of 58 games from 1973 through the 1974 season. It beat UCLA, the greatest dynasty in college basketball history, 7 consecutive championships. John Wooden, another Indiana guy who Everett Case competed against as a player and a coach, had the best program in the country. And Norm Sloan considered it a great tribute to his mentor and to his former coach to be able to end John Wooden and UCLA's streak of that. Now that allowed lots of other great players to come in. Kenny Carr, the only NC State player to ever win a Olympic gold medal. Hawkeye Whitney came down from DeMatha High School in Washington, D.C. All all kinds of great players wanted to come here, but Norm Sloan decided to leave in after the 1980 season. He had some disagreements with the basketball or the athletics director, and he moved on to Florida. That allowed NC State to go out and look for a new coach. Now, Willis Casey, an important figure in the history of college basketball, because he was the guy who brought television into college basketball. He arranged the first national broadcast between NC State and Maryland, Super Bowl Sunday, 1973. He was on the basketball rules committee that opened freshman eligibility. David Thompson couldn't play as a freshman. So those freshman games used to attract more people than the varsity games. So Willis Casey helped move through legislation that would allow freshmen to play. He also helped, because of the 74 team, when only one team per conference could go, Willis Casey pushed through the expansion of the NCAA tournament from 25 teams, which is what were in the tournament when NC State played the 1974 championship, to 36 teams. More than one team per conference could go. Now, I'm going to sidetrack just a little bit here, talking about NC State basketball, to talk about one other important, vastly, hugely important thing Willis Casey did. The Title IX of the 1972 Educational Act was passed and was going to be put into effect in 1976, which meant schools had to offer equal opportunity to women to play athletics. Willis Casey knew that that was going to happen, and he said, everybody's going to have to go through this. We might as well get the best person we can and be the best, put out the best women's athletics that we can. So he put in place an interim coach named Peanut Dope for a year. He went out and he found, thanks to his friend Smith Barrier at the Greensboro News and Record, a young coach, not a former college basketball player. She was a physical education major and a English major at East Carolina, who was a coach and PE instructor basically at Elon. Her name was Kay Yao, and he hired Kay Yao to be NC State's first basketball coach, women's basketball coach. She was the first women's coach, full-time women's coach at any school in the state. You see right beside her there is, to her right is Norlin Finch, who was a coach at Wake Forest and at Peace, that she eventually brought to be her assistant coach. And on the other side of Norlin is Susan Yao, NC State's first female All-American in any sport. Kay Yao didn't just coach basketball, she coached volleyball and she coached softball. And to show you what a great coach Kay Yao was, she won state championships in 2 sports her first year, and neither of them was basketball. She was a coach. She knew how to teach people how to play the game. Kay Yao was also the greatest ambassador NC State has ever had for students, for fans, for anybody who ever stepped foot on campus and happened to run into her. She would talk to them in her slow Gibsonville drawl and make them want to come here. Kay Yao did some amazing things, including in 1988, winning the gold medal at the Seoul, South Korea Olympics for USA basketball. She did that 6 months after being diagnosed and treated for breast cancer. Throughout her life, she was a basketball coach, but she was an ambassador for NC State University. In 2006, her cancer came back. She fought gallantly. One of the things she wanted to do was create something called Hoops for Hope, which was basically a game to bring awareness to the issues surrounding and about breast cancer and other forms of cancer. She wanted to fight with people and other survivors. She created Hoops for Hope, which has since turned into something we now call Play for K, which is the opportunity for high schools, junior highs, and other colleges to wear pink uniforms, fundraise for the Kay Yao Cancer Fund, do all those things that we know about. We most recently hosted the annual Play for K game that's now been going on for more than 15 years. And had the opportunity in Kay Yao's final couple of seasons to spend a lot of time with her, including some time while I was researching one of my books where we would just get on the phone and talk. And she would talk about her fight with cancer. Kay was not somebody who wanted to lead that kind of charge. And she wondered, is it okay for me to go out and talk about this? It's not really my style and I don't want to do it. And then someone explained it to her. Kay, you're the coach of this team too. You're the coach who can lead survivors, those who are going through cancer just like you did. You can not only help them, they will help you. And at that point, she decided to go public with her fight with cancer. She eventually succumbed to that in 2009, but nobody fought harder. Nobody had a larger group of people pulling for her, and nobody inspired more people than Kay Yow did throughout her whole journey with cancer. You can't talk about that without going through the exact same thing with Jim Valvano, who came here from Iona College after Norm Sloan left. He said on his first day of practice, I'm going to win a national championship. Who here wants to win it with me? And many of his players, most of whom were recruited by Norm Sloan, said they were all in. He had a couple of recruiting classes. And in 1983, NC State went on one of the wildest and most important rides in the history of college basketball. Now, I often get asked as a reporter, was that the biggest upset in NCAA tournament history? And sometimes I have written that in my old life, probably. But through the years and talking to Lorenzo Charles, the hero of that championship, I've come to the realization winning that game against Houston, which was ranked #1 in the country and had 22-game winning streak, whatever it was, coming into that game, it was not an upset. Beating Houston in the championship game was not an upset. The course of that year, 1982-83, there were 8 different teams that were ranked #1 in the country, most it's ever been. And NC State played 10 games against teams that were ranked #1 in the country. They beat 6 of them. The game against Houston was the 10th and final game that they had the opportunity to do it. They had already beaten Virginia twice, Carolina twice, and had beaten UNLV earlier in the tournament. It was all set up. That team had changed so much because Derek Wittenberg, one of the 3 seniors on that team, had broken his foot and had to be replaced in the lineup. They matured in a different way. They played a different style. And for 3 straight weeks in the NCAA tournament, in the ACC tournament, NC State put together the greatest run, 3-week, 9-game run in NCAA tournament. I do not like to call this an upset that they beat Houston on that last second play where Derek Wittenberg took a 25-foot shot and Lorenzo Charles grabbed the ball in midair and dunked it for the winning points. I don't like to call that a upset. I think it was the culmination of the greatest Cinderella story in the history of the NCAA tournament. I don't think it was an upset. Many things changed after the history or after that tournament. Jim Valvano became the most popular coach, the highest paid coach, the most sought after speaker, the most everything after that. And it changed the way he coached and what he was able to do. He still brought in great players. He brought in Chris Washburn. He brought in Charles Shackelford. He brought in Chris Corchiani and Rodney Monroe, Fire and Ice. Everybody, we know about those guys. Tom Gugliotta. But there were things that were going on underneath the program. And eventually in 1990, Jim Valvano left NC State. It was not a pretty parting. NC State in some ways have never recovered from that. But there was also the opportunity to take the legacy of NC State basketball and build on it. Guys like Todd Fuller came in, who helped restore some of the academic standards that were lacking during the Jim Valvano years. When Herb Sendek came in, he went through a slow progress his first 5 years, but then he brought in guys like Julius Hodge and Ilian Eftimov and Engan Atzor and players who helped bring them back to the NCAA tournament. When I talk about personalities, there's never been a greater personality in NC State basketball than Julius Hodge, because he was just so ebullient with his passion for the game. with his ability to bring others along with him for the ride that he wanted to have. Now, I've talked a whole lot, almost without taking a breath here, about NC State basketball. But what I'd like to do in the time we have remaining, we have about 20 minutes. Roger, I'd like for you to sort of chime in and talk a little bit about what you learned during the process that we had of putting together the book, which was a celebration of the first 100 years of basketball. And now as we reflect back on it 10 years later, what we had and did in that book.
Yeah, it's really hard to believe it's been 10 years before since we did all this. Collecting the images and everything was very interesting to me. A good chunk of the pictures, considering my time while I was at the News and Observer and the 5 years I was at NC State as a student, there were a lot of pictures of mine that naturally fit in with what we were doing. Most of the pictures, if not all, of Albano are of mine. And then I was fortunate, I photographed, I believe, every single game, and that was in Reynolds Coliseum for 5 years, except for one game. I missed a Louisville game one year so I could go see the Nutcracker with my girlfriend at the time, that I'm still a little upset about that I missed that game. But it was interesting in pulling these pictures. Not a lot of the older stuff was around. Thank goodness that University Archives is an amazing entity. If you don't have, if you've never had the opportunity to go to the archives, you can even go online and just kind of go through and just wander the halls, so to speak. You can have a nice deep dive of all the wonderful images that Archives has. It's all online. You can go through the university's website to find it. It's really kind of cool. They've got all the old Agromex there. They also have most of the technicians are also published in digital form. So you can do some research and look. It was tough finding a lot of these pictures in order to publish them in the book because they were such low resolution. So it was interesting to do that, to have the software to be able to blow some of them up so we could use them. The majority of the people very early on that Tim mentioned, it was very hard to find pictures of them, particularly if there was pictures of them playing basketball. The early coaches that we didn't have anything of, some of the players. The fact that some of the players were also great baseball players was very interesting to find and go through baseball archives. So it was a great process putting it together. Tim had some interns that had been helping him within Sports Information that scanned a lot of the images that the university had. So we had access to that as well, which was kind of cool. And then it was just a process of putting it all together to make this book and just combining it all. Tim wrote all the words. I wrote all the captions, I guess, for the most part. Took care of the design of it. But the 90% of it was Tim. I was very fortunate that he let my name be on the cover of the book with him. I like to claim that I am a co-author with him, but it was all Tim. And I have to give him all the props for everything that he did. So thank you, Tim, for including me in the process. It was a labor of love.
Pictures make it prettier, always. Pictures make it prettier.
Thank you. And, you know, I just use that's all I do to do anything to work is just click, click, click. That's all I do.
Well, Roger stole a little bit about what I was going to say as we go into questions. I want to say something both about the Alumni Association and the NCSU libraries for giving us the opportunity to do this. Thank you so much. We've both relied on them, as Roger said, for all of our research, for answering questions, for finding out more information. They are so important to everybody we have at the university to maintain the connection that we have to our years, to past years, and to the current and future students we bring on campus. The digital archives save me so much time, especially during this time of pandemic where we can't go and do things. I can't go to campus and research. Having them online, especially the Agromex, the technicians, the bulletins, the NC State News, all of those things make my job so much easier. It's almost as if it's not difficult at all to find what we're looking for. So, you know, we have the Numia message, we have technician, all of those things are digitized and it makes so much of a difference. So if you're looking for a special project coming up on March 24th, NC State's Day of Giving, I suggest thinking to keep the libraries in mind, keep the Alumni Association in mind, find the right gift that you can give. Now, I will tell you, nobody told me to say that, but I think the Day of Giving is one of the most important things that we do, especially right now. especially as the university struggles to maintain, to give the same experience that we all had at NC State to current students and to the future students. Those resources are hugely important, so support them if you can. With that, I'm ready to open it up to any kind of questions that you might have.
Yeah, sorry about that. All right, so first question we have, if David Thompson is the greatest, who is the second greatest player in school history?
In NC State history, I've often had that argument or that discussion. I don't like to call them arguments, but I would certainly think that the person who's followed in his immediate steps and led the ACC scoring in 2 straight years after David Thompson led the ACC in scoring 3 straight years, Kenny Carr from Washington, D.C., who was a football tight end, and he looked like it. Completely different player than David Thompson, but he was a scorer. He was a rebounder. He was the first NC State player to declare hardship for the NCAA for the NBA to be able to be drafted and play. He had a long and glorious career in Los Angeles and Portland. He is certainly among that discussion. Ronnie Shavlik, who came from Denver, was the first national recruit that Everett Case brought in, and the first 2-time All-American in the ACC in its earliest days, would certainly be in that discussion. It's hard for people to wrap their arms around who, how to qualify people, but those people, those players made a huge difference in the program's history. Ronnie Shavlik was a program maker. Kenny Carr was somebody who made a huge difference. Rodney Monroe, obviously all-time leading scorer, thanks to, in part, Chris Corchiani, who was always required to throw him the ball. Those guys all are in that conversation. I don't feel it necessary to put qualitative numbers on everyone, but certainly there have been a number of great NC State players who could be in that discussion.
Was there a difference in the feelings of Wolfpack followers between the 74 championship and the 83 championship?
All right, so here's the way I like to think about it, is that in 1974, Norm Sloan said all he had to do with that team, it had so much talent. It had a Major League Baseball player. It had 2 great future NBA players. It had 2 guys who went on to become great coaches. All he had to do was sit back and let them play. And everybody knew that they were good. They were undefeated the year before in 1973. They didn't get to play in the NCAA tournament because of a slightly bogus probation that prevented them from playing in the postseason, but helped them win the 1973 ACC championship. But that team, everybody knew was going to challenge UCLA for the championship. The 1983 team was good and better than people might remember them being in the early part of that season, but it was not good at times during that season after Derek Wittenberg broke his foot and missed 5 weeks of the season. It was not a good team, but it was readjusting itself. What it had that the 74 team, it had a coach that did not sit back and would not sit back and would not let his team think that it was not going to be successful in the NCAA tournament. We got a couple of inklings when they were able to play a couple of games. Wake Forest came in the final regular season game of the 83 season and scored 89 points in an ACC game against NC State. NC State won that game by 41 points, 130-89. That's when they knew that something good could happen. They had just beaten Carolina. Derek Wittenberg was back. They went to the tournament. They beat Wake Forest 5 days after beating them by 41 by 1 point. They beat North Carolina in double overtime after having beaten them in the regular season. And then they played Ralph Sampson and they play against Virginia in the ACC championship game. Now, don't let people tell you, because it's often a repeated myth, that NC State had to win the 1983 ACC tournament to make it into the NCAA tournament. but by beating North Carolina, the defending national champion, in the semifinals of the tournament. That got them in, but Jim Valvano didn't want his team to think they could rest on that laurel. He said, let's remove all doubt. Let's get the automatic bid. Let's go beat Virginia. And they did, thanks in part to a technical foul called in the second half of a game against Virginia assistant coach Jim Larinaga, who's now the head coach at Miami. They were in, and then that's what started the run. They almost lost in double overtime against Pepperdine, a team they knew nothing about, in a place they knew nothing about, Corvallis, Oregon, where the river runs north. It doesn't run south. They knew nothing about where they were or what they were doing. They won that game, even though Sidney Lowe had fouled out in the final stages of regulation. And that started the run. They beat UNLV. They beat Utah basically on its home court. And then they beat Virginia again to go to the Final Four. And once they got to the Final Four on that national stage, in that presence, nobody was going to beat Jim Valvano. And each of his players will tell you that.
Given NC State has not returned to its basketball heyday of the 70s and 80s, was it a mistake to force Jim Valvano out in 1990?
It's a difficult and challenging question. I remember as a sports writer writing that Jim Valvano was bringing negative publicity to NC State at that time. There were a whole lot of things going on in the program. There were a whole lot of things going on in college basketball as a whole. Jim Valvano was not necessarily, flouting the rules as they were, but he was also not necessarily maintaining the academic integrity that we all, as NC State graduates, employees, students, alumni, all those things would want in the program. Jim Valvano was a great coach. Like all of us, he was a flawed human being. And whether we can look back 30 years hence and say that shouldn't have happened, I guess it's 40 years hence now to say that shouldn't have happened. I can't second guess the decision. But it certainly changed the trajectory of NC State basketball from that time forward.
Let's see. Can you touch on the Old Dixie Classic and the Big Four tournament?
Absolutely. The Dixie Classic was such a great event. And it was one of those things that Everett Case, every place he ever went, he had a tournament that was on his home court. He brought in his 5 favorite officials and rotated them out throughout the day. He would find out who the best recruits were in, 3 years before and invite that team from around the country to come to NC State to play, to showcase them. The best example of that being Oscar Robertson from Indiana, who went to Cincinnati. When he was a freshman, Everett Case invited them to come play during Robertson's senior year. The 1958 Dixie Classic was one of the greatest displays of talent that has ever been seen in Reynolds Coliseum. NC State beat Michigan State with Jumpin' Johnny Green, and Cincinnati with Oscar Robertson. It was a tremendous event for race relations in Raleigh because they were bringing Everett Case throughout the Dixie Classic, brought integrated teams to play against his own teams. Everett Case did not integrate basketball, which was, I think, his biggest failing as NC State's coach. But he was also, at the time, NC State integrated ACC athletics, which it did in 1957 with Erwin Holmes and Walter Holmes and the 4 students who came to NC State in the 56-57 school year. Everett Case was coming off of probation in 1955 from the NCAA, and then he was coming off the biggest probation the NCAA had ever given to a college basketball program. 4 years, all sports were on probation and could not participate in any postseason events. And on the heels of that, when Everett Case tried to recruit his first Black player in 1957, the school administration said, "We've been through too much. We can't go and fight that battle too," because of everything that they had to go through, because NC State was in deep, deep trouble with the NCAA and with the ACC during that time, because that's when the 1950s were a time that the NCAA tried to crack down on the recruiting practices that made schools like Kentucky and Adolph Rupp and Villanova and other schools made them have these great programs, but the NCAA started cracking down on them. They had the point shaving scandals in 1950 and 1961. And it was a time when the NCAA was trying to rein in a lot of the coaches that created a free-for-all. And that's what college basketball was in the 50s. In the 60s, the ACC was kind of a renegade conference because there was a fight just about every night at the games between players, not between fans, but between players. And so it was a time of transition from those 50s and 60s to begin to regulate basketball more. And with Reynolds Coliseum, the Dixie Classic was the perfect place to bring to a national stage those schools. It was the biggest and best event in the country during those years, and it was the biggest thing going on in Raleigh for all of you people out there who asked for those tickets for Christmas presents. I envy you the opportunity to have gone to see those.
We have a question for Roger.
Okay.
What is your favorite photo of the time you were at the time you were at NC State?
That is an interesting question. I have so many. I've got a couple here. Probably this one here is probably one of my all-time favorite ones of Chucky Brown. Simply because this one kind of made me think that I knew what I was doing. It got won a lot of awards, and it was just a really nice shot. And this was in the old Reynolds Coliseum, in which the background, because the fans were so far back and the band and everybody, the way the light was on the court, the light is just absolutely perfect in my eyes. I know it was old film days, so it's got a little bit of a grain to it. But the fact that the light in Reynolds Coliseum just fell off like it did was just absolutely amazing to me. And then probably in second place with that is this shot of Lorenzo Charles that I shot. And of course, that young whippersnapper, Michael Jordan, with him. And this was just one of those pictures to me that just really stood out as two guys who were just absolutely brutalizing each other at that time out on the court. I just love that picture. Lowe was a great guy. I always enjoyed talking with him, and I was fortunate enough to spend some time with Michael Jordan on the road when he was playing baseball when I was at the News and Observer, so I got to know him a little bit then. But that's probably two of my favorite shots. One of the more interesting ones was after I'd gone back to the university and started working, was being able to mount a camera back behind the backboard and get Kenny Inge here, this Virginia game and this block. And that's just the kind of thing that was always fun, a little something different to do. But I was very fortunate to be at the university in from 82 until I graduated in 87. Like I said, I never missed a basketball game except for that one game. And I was on the court when we beat Carolina in 83. It's very fortunate that someone like Ed Seaman, who was a sports information director at the time, was willing to give the technician and agromech photographers extra credentials. And it was really neat. They would never do that today, that he would always let students come in at halftime because he knew that the News and Observer would leave, the Charlotte Observer, Durham Herald Sun, they would all leave at halftime to make deadline. So there was space down on the court. And so he would come and get us. We'd wait outside the door and we'd get a second half pass and be able to go in and shoot. And I think that was one of the great things about being at NC State and having that opportunity to make so many great pictures because of people like Ed Seaman. That's for sure.
So we are at 6:30. We do have a couple questions that are still coming in. So I can go ahead and ask those. Is that okay with you, Tim and Roger?
I'm here right up until tip-off at 7 o'clock.
And okay. I may bug out a little early because I've got a tennis match at 7 o'clock.
Okay, so I have a couple more that have come in and a couple memories to share. One memory that came in is my favorite memory in Reynolds was the one time David Thompson dunked in a game and the crowd went wild. That was the loudest I've ever heard it at Reynolds.
His, you know, like I said, dunking was not allowed, but he got a breakaway in the second half against UNC Charlotte, where he ended up with the ball in the backcourt, nobody around him. And he said, you know what? I haven't been able to do this my whole career. It's my last game. They had just retired his number 44 jersey and were ready to put it in the rafters. And he went down and did an uncontested dunk in that game. The place did go wild. It was the only time he ever intentionally dunked in a game, and he was called for a technical foul. It didn't count. And the thing about that, if that basket had counted as it would in today's game, David Thompson would have ended the 1974 season with exactly 30 points per game. No person in the ACC has averaged more than 30 points or 30 points a game since 1961. So it would have been the only time in 60 years that somebody had averaged 30 points for a season, and it was disallowed because dunking was not allowed at the time.
All right. There's quite a few comments on here about people watching the 83 game in their dorm rooms, being there. It seemed like, and everyone just is talking about how it was a once in a lifetime experience.
All right, here's a great story about those people who watched in their dorm rooms. So at the time they were playing Virginia in the ACC championship game. It was spring break. So there are a lot of people who stayed and a lot of people who were just coming back to campus after that. So out at Sullivan Dorm and Lee Dorm, which is out by the baseball stadium, people were out there watching the Virginia game, but there was a baseball game going on at Doak Field at the time. There was a major league pitcher, Dan Plesac, on the mound for NC State. He eventually became a major league pitcher. He's on the MLB Tonight every night if you have the baseball network. He was pitching. There was a future major league shortstop at second base. At shortstop, who named Doug Strange, who at the exact moment the game against Virginia ended, had a ground ball hit to him. He fielded it. The crowd goes wild in Lee and Sullivan dorms. It distracted him. He threw the ball away, and NC State lost the baseball game because it won a basketball game. It's one of my all-time favorite stories.
We also are getting quite a few questions about Jim Valvano and his relationship with Dean Smith.
It's funny because you would think they really disliked each other, and they did on the court. But I covered Carolina for about 6 years when I was working in newspapers at the Durham paper and at the Greensboro paper. I got to know him a little bit, and he actually really, really enjoyed Jim Valvano because Jim Valvano lived sort of the same kind of life. He was always in the spotlight, always in the, people are always talking about him. I remember him talking about, he was over at McGregor Downs where Jim Valvano lived, and his family lived there. And Dean happened to be going over to a wedding. And so he just popped in at Jim's house, and Jim came out, he hosted him, they had dinner, they just yucked it up. The two of them were on the exact same plane sitting across from each other in first class when they both went out to recruit Shaquille O'Neal, both of whom wanted them, but neither could afford him. And so he ended up going to LSU. But Dean Smith told me about that airplane flight that they just had the best time being together because Jim kept him in stitches, and Jim could keep people in stitches. It's the best thing about him. And it's why I wanted to become a reporter. I thought dealing with a coach like him was the way everybody I was going to deal with would be. I found that not to be true when I started covering Dean Smith and I started covering Mike Krzyzewski and all kinds of people throughout the course. Those who threatened to beat me up, those who threatened to sue my paper, those who threatened to call my editor, all those things that newspaper reporters go through happened through the years. And my experience was not the same as it was when I dealt with and learned about Jim Valvano. And this picture Roger has here is when they're unfurling the the national championship banner in 1983 in the opening game against Western Carolina of the 1983-84 season. The fun thing about that, I was at this game. This is my first in-person NC State basketball game. NC State had been on the road for 13 straight games, the entire end of the season in 1983, and the first 8 games, I believe, of the 1983-84 season. So this is the first time everybody got together and was able to celebrate it. And it was an amazing, amazing game.
All right. So I think we're pretty much wrapping it up now. And I think this the last question / comment I have for you is, Tim, please write an autobiography about Coach Case.
All I'm going to say is I spent all of last weekend in Indiana, specifically to go get some research on Coach Case. I am going to spend the entire of the NCAA tournament, I hope, in Indianapolis, doing some more research about Coach Case. And good Lord willing, I hope I can spend some time telling and finding more stories to tell about the most important figure in ACC basketball history, most important figure in North Carolina history, because so few people know and remember about him. And I'm not so sure how much we knew about him while he was here. That's the thing that's interesting. Everett Case had a life in Indiana high school basketball. He had a life in the U.S. Navy as a basketball and physical education instructor in the Navy, training World War II bomber and fighter pilots. And then he had a life at NC State. And none of those strings have ever really been connected. And I'd dearly love to be able to do that.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for this presentation. It's a great way to get ready for the game coming up at 7 o'clock, right?
Mhm.
That's right.
All right. And I'm going to go ahead and drop a survey in the chat for people to take. We are doing a raffle with the survey, and we'll be giving away 3 of Tim's books. So if you're interested, go ahead and take the survey. I'm going to drop that in the chat now. Feel free to send friends of the library any questions you have, any other questions you have, and we'll be happy to answer those.
Allison, if you don't mind, could you drop my email in there? And anybody who has questions or has comments or want to reach out directly to me, I would be more than happy to do that. If you happen to be someone who looks for speakers to talk about various subjects, I'd be happy to do that with just about any organization, especially those of you maybe in Australia or Hawaii. Those are 2 places I'm looking to go to sometime.
Willing to pay for Tim to go.
Any of those things. But I'd love to be able to continue to share messages and stories about NC State basketball, because it means a lot to me.
Great. All right. I'm dropping that in the chat now. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, Allison. Bye, everybody. Go Pack.
Thanks, everybody. I do appreciate the time.